You think discipline is about willpower. It is not. Discipline is about what you do with your emotions. Welcome to the Budo Diary podcast. I'm Przemek Paleczny, a philosopher by training and a long-time martial artist. Here I examine the core concepts of Budo through the lens of philosophy to clarify their meaning and implications. In the previous episode, I examined the concept of discipline in relation to self-control and Zanshin. The relation is as follows. Zanshin creates awareness, which makes self-control possible. Discipline stabilizes self-control over time. However, discipline fails at the level of emotions. Today, I will focus on this greatest obstacle to maintaining discipline: fatigue, distraction, stress, procrastination. Almost everything that stands between us and discipline ultimately comes down to emotions. Therefore, to maintain discipline, we need to work with emotions. This is the main topic of this episode. In the previous episodes, I argued that mental capacity for control is analogous to physical strength. We need a minimal level of physical power to begin training. Through repetition and the careful pushing our limits, we develop greater strength. The same applies to control capacity. It requires both a minimal threshold and repeated, structured effort. Let's now extend the analogy further. This is crucial. In physical training, we work with weight in a kind of laboratory environment, where it is isolated from external factors. It has to be slightly above our bottom line, but also below a certain upper limit, somewhere in between our physical capacities. Consistent work within this range develops greater strength and gradually pushes both limits upward. Analogously, in mental training we work with emotions. They also have to remain above our bottom line and below our upper limit, somewhere between a level where emotions are not a problem and a level where they become overwhelming. Consistent work within this structure should develop our mental control capacity. The relationship between repetitive action, emotions, and discipline works in both directions. Repetitive, disciplined action enables us to work with emotions, which in turn strengthens our discipline. Strengthened discipline then allows for more effective work with emotions, which in turn makes more demanding disciplined action possible. This mechanism operates within a broader system that I outlined in the previous episodes. Zanshin is the state of awareness. Awareness opens the space for self-control. Self-control enables effective, disciplined action. Discipline makes this action persistent over time. Working with emotions is located between self-control and discipline. We need a minimum level of self-control to work with emotions, and discipline to ensure that the effects of this work are not only momentary, but persistent over time. Now let's take a closer look at how this works. In martial arts, repetitive action creates a laboratory-like environment for working not only with physical limits, but also with mental obstacles. This environment should be structured so that we remain within the boundaries of our bottom and upper limits. To work with emotions within this structure, we need to realize that emotions are not opposed to control. They form a system of immediate evaluation embedded in our brains. This is an evolutionary justified function. It reduces the cognitive resources required to make fundamental decisions, such as whether to fight or flee. In this sense, emotions operate as fast, pre-reflective judgments. They do not follow deliberation, they precede it. A lack of emotions creates a deficit that demands greater cognitive resources. Acting in a life and death situation under such conditions would likely end tragically. Therefore, emotions are not our enemy. We should not try to fight them. Working with emotions in martial arts training is not about eliminating them. It is about transforming our relationship to them. What we should constantly strive to do is keep emotions within the field of awareness without losing the structure of our action. Working with emotions consists of 3 elements. Zanshin is the perceptual condition. We need to be aware in order to notice our emotions before they take control. Adapting a more detached perspective allows us to observe emotions without succumbing to them. For example, you notice that you are becoming frustrated during sparring. Self-control is the executive condition. We need to act despite our emotions. Therefore, we must be able to control ourselves. Only under this condition is it possible to maintain the proper structure of action. For example, even if you are frustrated during sparring, you need to act in accordance with the proper structure. Therefore, you need self-control to prevent your emotions from driving your actions. Discipline is the stability condition. As explained in the previous episode, self-control driven by motivation alone is only temporary. It is not the kind of control that martial arts aim to cultivate. True control is stable over time. This is the role of discipline. It stabilizes the maintenance of control in the long run. For example, acting consistently despite frustration builds discipline, and strengthened discipline in turn enables greater self-control and more consistent action. Zanshin is the basis of the entire system. It introduces a distance that enables 3 things. First, non-identification. We do not identify ourselves with our emotions. They appear like other signals that come from the body. We are not them. They simply happen to us. Second, non-suppression. We do not suppress emotions that arise, nor do we oppose or fight them. We accept each emotion as it is, without attaching ourselves to it. Third, non-reactivity. Since do we not attach to emotions, they do not drive our actions. In other words, we do not react to emotions, but maintain the structure of our action despite them. Zanshin creates the foundation of attention that separates the arising of emotions from our reaction. In the episode on self-control, I introduced 2 modes of working with emotions in both training and everyday life. The first is controlled expression. While maintaining the necessary distance, we may choose to consciously channel our emotions into direct expression. In life, we may take the form of speech, writing, or physical release, for example in martial arts training. However, it may be difficult to distinguish conscious action from mere impulse. As a result, it is easy to rationalize impulse as a conscious act. Moreover, even consciously acting under the influence of emotion risks losing control and sliding into psychological or even physical violence. The second mode is letting go. While maintaining distance, we may choose to consciously allow an emotion to arise and then let it fade on its own. The very act of acceptance weakens the emotion, which in turn makes it easier to let it go. The fading occurs because the emotion is neither maintained nor suppressed. It passes like a cloud in the sky. This mode risks slipping from release into suppression, as the latter may be mistaken for the former. Because of these limitations, the 2 modes are complementary. Sometimes it is better to express emotions directly rather than slip into suppression, and sometimes it is better to let them go rather than slip into violence. Now, the model needs to be extended with a third mode, cognitive reappraisal. While maintaining the distance created by Zanshin, emotions and their sources can be analyzed. As a result, the situation that gives rise to the emotion can be reinterpreted in a way that no longer triggers the same response. For example, During sparring, you may reinterpret a frustrating situation as a lesson, or as in BJJ, as a game. If sparring is understood as play, there is no need for frustration. Over time, you will improve, just as every player does. A similar approach is used in cognitive behavioral therapy and is well documented in psychotherapy, where it is known as cognitive reappraisal. This method is not easily applicable in sudden, momentary situations such as those in the dojo. It requires deeper reflection and time. However, what is once deeply analyzed in a more convenient environment becomes available for use in less predictable situations. The fundamental mistake we often make is that when we become emotional, we react to our emotions and let them drive our actions. Training in Zanshin teaches us to pause before reacting and then to choose a mode of working with emotions. On this basis, we act with a proper structure regardless of our emotional state. This is the essence of working with emotions. Martial arts training provides a controlled environment for calibrating control capacity under pressure. Kata is a pure form of repetition. It minimizes external variables, allowing precise control over both action and attention. It represents a basic level, where the only pressure comes from our own body and our lack of mental capacity for control. There are no external variables that could disturb our practice. Therefore, in kata it is relatively easy to maintain Zanshin, self-control and discipline. As such, it helps us stabilize the structure of both technique and attention. Sparring introduces controlled variability, making emotional regulation an active component of performance. It is a situation in which we must make decisions under real external pressure. However, a training session is still far removed from the stress of competition or real combat. It still isolates both our physical effort and our emotions from many of the external factors present in competition and real combat. Therefore, it allows us to remain within the boundaries of our bottom and upper limits. Within this structure, we can work with our emotions and strengthen our mental condition. Finally, if we work consistently, we may become ready for competition, where the pressure is at its highest. At that point, we need to know both how to win and how to lose. A compelling example is a kendo match. Competitors are not allowed to show emotions. It may result in losing a point. How can one maintain control of emotions in such an intense situation? Discipline is not our enemy. On the contrary, it helps us work with emotions. A kendoka simply follows the protocol, doing what they have done countless times after a match. It is easier to work with emotions when no additional thinking is required. This repetitive behavior, practiced countless times, not only helps in stressful situations such as competition, but also functions within a feedback loop. It trains both our self-control and our awareness. Because the action is repeatable, you do not need to think about what to do. You can focus on yourself, notice your emotions, and choose how to work with them. This is training in Zanshin, self-control and discipline. The same mechanism that operates in the dojo also applies to everyday situations in life, wherever stress becomes an obstacle to proper action. For example, in interpersonal conflicts. Such a conflict is also a kind of battle. Ideally, it is a battle of arguments, not a verbal fight. However, in both cases stress arises, and it is easy to lose the proper structure of action. Remaining in Zanshin means maintaining distance from emotions and not allowing them to drive our behavior impulsively. This distance allows us to notice emotions, not attach to them, and choose how to work with them. This is discipline. Now, Let us examine the boundaries of the model. As already mentioned, there is always a bottom line and upper line. The model I have presented operates only within these boundaries. It is not a problem if we remain below our bottom line. This leads only to stagnation rather than development. The real problem arises when we exceed our upper limit. Whether physically or mentally, there is a threshold beyond which the model collapses. In training, it is relatively easy to control the conditions of practice and remain within these boundaries. In life, however, we sometimes exceed the upper limit and become overwhelmed. Therefore, it is essential to know our limits. This is easier in the case of physical limits, but more difficult when it comes to mental ones. People often function beyond their mental upper limits for years, but developing mental issues while rationalizing their effort as pushing their limits, as in training. For this reason, I strongly recommend remaining aware of yourself and seeking professional help when necessary. As always, the foundation of everything is the ancient principle: know who you are. This was the 11th episode of the Budo Diary podcast. By analogy to physical training, I examined mental capacity for control and the process of working with emotions. Within the model developed in previous episodes, I placed emotions between self-control and discipline. Accordingly, I defined working with emotions as keeping them within the field of awareness while maintaining the structure of action. Zanshin, self-control, and discipline were identified as necessary conditions for working with emotions, and 3 modes of this process were distinguished: controlled expression, letting go, and cognitive reappraisal. Finally, I briefly examined how working with emotions operates both inside and outside the dojo, particularly in kata, sparring, and competition, as well as in interpersonal conflicts. Zanshin does not control or suppress emotions. It creates a space in which emotions do not take control of our actions. In this way, I examine the level of the mind that Zanshin regulates, namely self-control, discipline, and emotions. In the next episode, I will turn to how Zanshin regulates our relationship to others. What is respect, and how can it be understood without sliding into subjection? How can we be respectful in a rational way? How can we demand respect from others? This will be the questions guiding the next inquiry. Thank you for listening.